the graying hair pulled back in a simple bun. Reading glasses on a chain. The tired shuffle of someone counting down to retirement. That's what Dr. Pierce saw when Margaret Walsh clocked in for the night shift at Cedar Creek Medical, her name badge still showing the generic stock photo from orientation 11 months ago. What he didn't see was the way her hands never trembled during a code. The surgical precision when she inserted fours on the first stick every single time. The cold assessment in her eyes when she scanned a room the way a combat surgeon scans a battlefield. They didn't know. He had no idea. She'd spent 23 years as Captain Margaret Walsh, and no amount of graying hair dye and deliberate exhaustion was going to change what lived underneath. The ICU at Cedar Creek hummed with the soft rhythm of machines keeping people alive. Margaret moved through it like a ghost, present but unnoticed, necessary but forgettable. That was the whole point. Her real assignment wasn't healing patients. It was protecting one patient in particular. Room for 47 held a CIA asset, a man whose name she'd never learned, whose face she'd memorized the moment she'd seen it in the classified briefing 2 weeks before her placement. Post-operative care, they told her. Routine recovery from abdominal surgery. Monitor vitals. Watch for infection. Report any irregularities up the chain. The chain that didn't exist anywhere in Cedar Creek's employee directory. The chain that only existed in a secure phone buried in her locker beneath 3 years' worth of accumulated scrubs. Her mission handler had been clear: maintain the cover at all costs. Maintain it for 18 months, minimum. Don't draw attention. Don't excel. Don't fail. Be invisible. Be forgettable. Be just a nurse. She could do invisible. She'd been doing it for 2 decades. The night shift started at 11 p.m., and Margaret arrived at 10:33, 15 minutes early like always. The Atlanta evening was thick and humid, rain hammering the parking lot in sheets that sounded like applause. She sat in her 10-year-old Honda Civic for 3 minutes, running her fingers over the faded unit patch sewn inside the jacket hanging on her passenger seat. The 3rd Special Forces Group insignia, so worn that the colors had faded to watercolor pastels. She'd stitched it there herself 12 years ago, during her last deployment to Kandahar. Some people carried wedding rings. Some carried photos. Margaret carried a faded patch that had no business being hidden in a jacket lining, and she touched it now the way other people said prayers. The tremor in her left hand surfaced as she grabbed her badge and her stethoscope. Kandahar. The IED had been buried under 2 inches of packed earth, and her left side had caught the shrapnel, a ricochet that the surgical team said had missed her artery by centimeters. She'd spent 6 weeks in Walter Reed. She'd done the physical therapy. She'd passed every test they threw at her. But sometimes, when she was tired, the tremor came back. A ghost of trauma living in her fingers. She pressed her palm flat against the steering wheel and counted to 10. The tremor stilled. Good. That was good. Control was everything. Cedar Creek Medical rose against the Atlanta skyline like a monument to organized chaos. 10 stories of glass and steel, fluorescent lights bleeding out into the night sky, ambulances arriving in a constant stream like pilgrims at a shrine. Margaret had walked these corridors for 347 days. She knew the texture of the tile under her shoes, the exact angle of the light in the stairwell on the 3rd floor, the smell of antiseptic that never quite masked the smell of something else, fear, maybe, or the faint copper tang of human suffering. The ICU occupied the entire 5th floor. 12 beds. For nurses per shift. 3 doctors on rotation. 1 security guard who checked his phone more than he checked the hallways. Margaret had memorized every detail in her first week. She memorized the way the coffee machine beeped 3 times before the cup dispensed. The way the fluorescent lights buzzed slightly on the east wing. The way the night shift had a rhythm to it, frantic from 11 p.m. to 1 a.m., stabilizing at 1 a.m., then settling into that deep quiet that only existed in hospitals after 2 in the morning, when the only sound was the soft percussion of ventilators and heart monitors keeping people alive through the dark. She badged in through the security door and made her way to the locker room. The patch was still there where she'd left it, sewn carefully into the jacket lining. She touched it once more, then hung the jacket in her locker, closed the door, and became Margaret Walsh, RN, for the next 12 hours. The night shift coordinator was Jenny, a woman in her 50s who'd worked Cedar Creek for 19 years and asked no questions about anything. That's why Margaret appreciated her. Jenny gestured toward the assignment board. Room 512 is yours again. Room 504, 506, 509. Standard post-ops. Nothing complicated. Dr. Pierce left notes about 447. He wants hourly checks on the abdominal wound site. Says the sutures might be irritating the skin. Probably nothing, but he wants it documented. Room for 47. The CIA asset. The man whose real name she wasn't allowed to know. The reason she was here. Understood, Margaret said. Her voice came out soft, careful, the voice of someone who'd learned to take up as little space as possible. I'll keep an eye on it. Thanks. Jenny was already moving, already thinking about the next thing, the next admission, the next crisis. That was the rhythm of the ICU. You were never done. You were just temporarily not drowning. Margaret started her rounds at midnight. Room 512 came last, after she'd checked on the others. Standard recovery cases, all of them stable, all of them sleeping the medicated sleep that post-operative patients slept. Vital signs good. For sites clean. No complications. She documented everything in the system with the precision that had made her lethal in operating theaters across 3 continents. Every detail mattered. Every number told a story. Room 512 was different. The patient in room 512 was awake. His name was Callahan, and he was a Green Beret recovering from a gunshot wound that had happened in circumstances no one at Cedar Creek was authorized to ask about. He was massive in the way that special operations soldiers were massive, not from a gym, but from 2 decades of carrying weapons and explosives through mountains. His right shoulder was wrapped, the wound site bandaged, his for running antibiotics and pain medication in a cocktail designed to keep him comfortable but not unconscious. He watched her enter the room with the kind of attention that suggested he was more alert than any post-operative patient should be. Vitals look good, Margaret said, moving through the checklist. She didn't make eye contact. Making eye contact was drawing attention. Drawing attention was a mistake. Oxygen saturation at 98. Heart rate steady at 64. Blood pressure 118/72. You did a tour in Kandahar. She stopped. Her hand froze on the 4 line. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator in the corner working its mechanical rhythm, pushing air in and out, keeping someone alive whether they wanted to be alive or not. She didn't look at him. She completed checking his foresight with the same methodical precision, documented the findings, and turned toward the door. The thoracotomy you did on yourself in Ramadi, Callahan said. His voice was the color of gravel, roughened by pain medication and something older. 2006, September. Bombed out school in the Jolan district. You used a combat knife because there was no scalpel. I watched you do it. I was 23 years old, and I was bleeding out, and you walked in like you owned the place and fixed me with nothing but a blade and hands that didn't shake. Margaret's left hand trembled. She gripped the 4 stand. Counted to 4. Released. The tremor stopped. She turned back to face him. His eyes were the color of the Atlantic in winter, and they held something that looked like recognition. Something that looked like a memory she'd buried deliberately, carefully, in a place she'd never meant to visit again. Phantom, he said quietly. That's what we called you. The unit in Ramadi. You were a legend. I'm a nurse, Margaret said. Her voice was still soft, still careful. Still invisible. You should rest now, Staff Sergeant. Your wound needs time to heal. My name is Callahan, he said. And I never forget. The people who saved my life, the people who stood there and held it together when everything was falling apart, I never forget. She left the room. She didn't run. Running was drawing attention. She walked back to the nurse's station with the same measured pace she used for everything, clocked the timestamps, documented the vitals, and then excused herself to the break room where the coffee had gone cold and the fluorescent lights buzzed their endless mechanical song. Her hands were steady now. That was good. Control was everything. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was knowing that someone had recognized her. The worst part was understanding that her cover, which had felt impenetrable just moments before, suddenly had a crack in it. The worst part was knowing that she'd have to tell her mission handler, and that he would have choices to make about whether she could continue the assignment or whether she'd have to disappear again. Margaret sat in the break room for 7 minutes. She didn't drink the cold coffee. She didn't look at her phone. She sat and breathed and remembered what it meant to be invisible, and then she stood and walked back out into the ICU where the machines were humming their constant song and where Staff Sergeant Callahan was waiting in room 512, and where everything was about to change whether she was ready for it or not. Margaret returned to room 512 3 minutes after the shift change, moving through the ICU corridors with the kind of invisible efficiency that had kept her alive in places where being noticed meant being targeted. Staff Sergeant Callahan was propped on his left side, the right side of his chest still angry with fresh surgical dressings from the shrapnel extraction. His family had left an hour ago. His mother's prayers still seemed to linger in the recycled air like antiseptic and regret. She was checking his drain output when Dr. Pierce appeared in the doorway. He didn't knock. He held her chart in one hand like a prosecutor holding evidence, and his jaw was already working the way it did when he decided someone needed to be corrected in front of witnesses. Callahan's older sister sat in the corner chair, still in her church clothes, still holding her purse like she might need to leave quickly. "Nurse Walsh." Pierce's voice had the texture of gravel in a disposal. "Room for 47. Mrs. Chen. Your most recent note questions my antibiotic selection." He held up the chart. Callahan's sister leaned forward. This was what Pierce was good at, creating an audience, making sure the humiliation had witnesses. "You wrote here that her renal function suggests we should adjust the dosing. Are you aware that you are a nurse, not a physician? That your job is to administer what I prescribe, not to think?" Margaret kept her hand steady on Callahan's full line. "The creatinine clearance is down to 38 milliliters per minute," she said, her voice level as a cardiac monitor on a stable rhythm. "The drug half-life with renal impairment means I don't pay you to think." Pierce stepped fully into the room now, making sure his words had maximum penetration. "I pay you to follow orders. To observe. To document. Not to question my clinical judgment in writing where it creates a permanent record of your insubordination." His finger jabbed at the chart. "If you can't manage that simple task, perhaps it's time for you to retire to somewhere you can't hurt anyone. Florida. Arizona. Somewhere your incompetence can't infect this unit." The fluorescent light overhead hummed its constant electric song. Margaret met his eyes with a stare so cold it seemed to lower the room temperature by degrees. She let the silence stretch. Not the silence of fear. The silence of someone who had watched men die in 120-degree heat and understood that words could wait. That sometimes the most dangerous thing in the room was simply refusing to break first. "If you spent half this energy on your patients instead of your paperwork," she said, her voice dropping to something quiet and absolutely final, "Mrs. Chen in 304 wouldn't still be septic from the contaminated supplies you signed off on last week." She turned from him then. Just turned. Didn't rush. Didn't show the small tremor of restraint that came from swallowing 17 years of command authority and replacing it with the accent of someone apologizing for existing. She walked past Pierce to the door, past his sister who had stopped breathing, past the way his face had gone the color of a hospital gown. "That's enough," Pierce said behind her. His voice had lost its gravel. It had become something thinner. Angrier. "You're finished here. This is insubordination. This is," but Margaret was already moving down the hallway, and his words scattered like birds against the thick plexiglass of her composure. The break room at lunch was where institutional cruelty revealed its true face. Margaret carried her meal, a container of overnight oats that tasted like cardboard soaked in regret, and sat at the long table by the window that overlooked the Atlanta skyline. The city sprawled out there, indifferent, full of people who didn't know that a woman was about to become invisible in front of 5 witnesses. Nurse Richardson arrived first, her tray balanced with the focus of someone carrying something explosive. She saw Margaret and the hesitation lasted exactly 1 heartbeat. Then she turned and left. Followed by Patricia and Jensen and 2 nurses from the night shift who had somehow heard about the comment Margaret made to Pierce. The conversations died mid-sentence. A laugh cut off like power going out. Within 30 seconds, Margaret was alone at a table built for 12, her cold coffee going colder, the noise of the hospital filtering in from the hallway like the sound of a world that no longer contained her name. She didn't flinch. She ate mechanically. The muscles in her jaw worked on food that had no flavor, and her hands stayed still. Hands that had held trauma shears steady in a bombed-out school in Ramadi. Hands that had inserted central lines while bullets snapped overhead. Hands that remembered what it meant to do the job when the job meant survival. Those hands did not tremble. They did not betray the fact that she was running a calculation: how much cover could survive this? How much longer before the CIA handler made a call that erased her entire placement? By Thursday morning, Margaret knew the answer lived on the disciplinary board in the unit office. The notice was printed in that official hospital font that made everything sound authoritative and final. Written warning: Margaret Walsh, insubordination and failure to follow chain of command. Further incidents will result in immediate termination. She saw it when she clocked in at 6:08 a.m., and the charge nurse walked past her without eye contact or the small talk that usually marked the beginning of a shift. The notice had copies. Other people had already read it. Other people already knew that Margaret Walsh had stepped outside the invisible line that kept a person employed and safe and forgotten. She clipped her badge to her scrubs and moved into the unit where the machines were humming their constant song, where the fluorescent lights buzzed with their relentless frequency, where Dr. Pierce stood in his office with his arms crossed and watched her through the glass with the thin smile of a man who had decided that removing an obstacle was worth the paperwork. The morning report gave her 7 patients. Nothing critical. Just the slow work of recovery that happened when surgical sites began to understand they weren't dying, when sepsis finally released its grip, when the human body remembered how to heal. She was updating a chest tube output in room 308 when the shouting started. Not normal hospital shouting. Not a code blue or an emergency response. Raw. Uncontrolled. Explosive. You killed him. You killed my brother. The voice came from the elevator bay, moving toward the ICU like a storm front. Margaret's hand stilled on the 4 pump. The sound of chaos in a hospital was different from the sound of chaos on a battlefield, but the principle was the same: something had broken and was breaking everything around it. She moved toward the hallway. Other nurses were doing the same, slowing, turning, the way prey animals do when they hear a predator announce itself. A man in his 30s burst through the ICU doors. Wild-eyed. Disheveled in a way that spoke of sleepless nights and decisions made at 3 in the morning. His shirt was stained. His hands were shaking. And in his right hand, the light caught the edge of a blade, a 4-inch hunting knife with a handle wrapped in paracord, the kind of weapon that people carried with clear intention. Security guard Jenkins, who was 62 and built like he'd spent his entire life apologizing for existing, stepped forward with his hands up and his voice doing that placating thing that never worked. Sir, I need you to come with me." But the man's eyes had already found room 512. Callahan's room. The green beret in bed whose presence had somehow leaked from his file into the whisper network of a hospital that didn't know his name. A hospital where someone had a brother who died in Kandahar. A brother who had a face. A brother who had a name. And all of that rage was crystallizing into a single moment of clarity. "You military," the man screamed at Callahan's room. "You murdered my brother in Afghanistan and now." Margaret was already moving. Not thinking. The thinking part of her brain had been trained by the army to shut up when the doing part took over. Jenkins was 7 feet away. Callahan was behind her with fresh surgical wounds and family trauma and the kind of vulnerability that came from being unable to run. The knife was real. The intention was real. The 3 seconds between now and tragedy were compressing down to something countable. She stepped directly into the man's trajectory, 3 feet from Callahan's door, placing her body between his rage and the Green Beret's recovery like she'd done it 1,000 times before. Like she hadn't spent 11 months pretending to be just a nurse. Like her hands didn't remember this. Like her muscle memory wasn't about to betray her entire cover. The blade came up in a wild arc and Margaret's left arm moved to intercept it, not thinking, just doing, and the knife opened a gash across her forearm that immediately felt hot and bright. Her scrubs darkened. Her blood hit the tile. The sensation registered as information, 4-inch laceration, deep enough to need sutures, probably superficial to the radial artery but not by much. Pain is data. Pain is information about what's still working. The man stumbled. His eyes came into focus for just a second, the moment when rage met the reality of a woman bleeding between him and his target. He regained balance and lunged again, and Margaret was already moving inside his reach, already executing the disarm technique from Fort Bragg that had been burned into her muscle memory during a week in 2004 when the army decided it was useful to know how to take a knife away from someone who wanted to use it. Step inside. Control the wrist. Redirect the momentum. But the blade caught her deep in the right shoulder as they went down together, sliding between her deltoid and her rotator cuff in a way that made her vision white out for just a moment. The pain was immense. Clean. Specific. She noted it the way a pilot notes instrument readings during a descent. Still functional. Still conscious. Still able to do the job. She had him face down on the tile and controlled in 4 seconds, her forearm across his neck, her legs anchoring him, the knife clattering away. Her blood was pooling. A lot of it. Her shoulder was on fire and her forearm was throbbing, and Jenkins was finally moving, finally reaching down, finally understanding that something had just happened that he wouldn't be able to explain in his incident report. Call a crash cart, Callahan was yelling from his bed, despite the fresh surgical dressings that probably needed to stay still. Get someone, she's bleeding. The paramedics arrived in 90 seconds. ICU nurses converged like they'd been waiting for permission. Someone was applying pressure to her shoulder. Someone else was wrapping her forearm with gauze that went pink then red almost immediately. The room had filled with that particular frequency of controlled emergency response, the sound of people doing jobs they'd practiced 1,000 times before. And through it all, Margaret heard Callahan's voice, low and quiet, directed at one of the responding paramedics, Ramadi, 2006. I've seen that technique before. Only once. From a combat surgeon we called Phantom. The fluorescent light overhead hummed. Margaret's vision was starting to tunnel, the kind of peripheral narrowing that came with blood loss or adrenaline crashing or both. She let her eyes close for just a moment, and when they opened again, Dr. Pierce was standing in the doorway of the ICU, his expression moving from concern to calculation in the space of a heartbeat. His eyes went from Margaret's bleeding shoulder to Callahan's bed to Jenkins still holding the knife in an evidence bag, and something shifted behind his face. Something that looked almost like opportunity. That wasn't the worst part. The ICU hallway at Cedar Creek Medical went still. Then it didn't. A man in a wrinkled shirt burst through the stairwell door screaming his brother's name, his voice cracking like wetwood in a fire. Where is he? Where is my brother? His hand shook. His eyes had that particular glaze of someone who'd been told his family member wasn't coming home, who needed someone to blame more than he needed to breathe. Margaret recognized the look. She'd seen it in the mirrors of grief counseling rooms at Forward Operating Base Salerno. She'd seen it in the eyes of soldiers who'd lost their squad leaders in the dark. The man's left hand emerged from his jacket holding a knife. Not a kitchen knife. A serrated combat blade, 8 inches, the kind that catches on fabric and bone. The kind that doesn't forget what it cuts. Callahan. The Green Beret. Where is he? The man was moving toward room 512 now, his feet unsteady but his grip on the blade steady as a surgeon's hand. My brother was in his unit. My brother is dead because of him. Margaret didn't think. Thinking was for people who had the luxury of time. She moved. Her body had answers before her mind could formulate questions, muscle memory surfacing from the wreckage of a bombed-out school in Ramadi where she'd operated on a staff sergeant named Callahan with a field thoracotomy performed by combat knife because there wasn't a scalpel and there was bleeding and there was the choice between improvisation and a body bag. She stepped directly between the man and room 512. No hesitation. No calculation of odds. Just the absolute certainty of someone who had already decided they were expendable. The blade came up in a vicious arc. Margaret deflected it with her left forearm, the serrated edge catching her skin with a sensation like fire dragged across muscle. Blood bloomed across the white of her scrub sleeve. The man was already recovering, already pivoting for a second thrust, and Margaret's right shoulder was a wide target, an easy mark, and the blade found it without mercy. The knife went deep. Past skin. Past the deltoid muscle. The pain was information. Pain is clarity. Pain is the body screaming the precise location of catastrophic damage. Margaret felt the blade grind against the head of her humerus and she did what she'd been trained to do in every combat medic course the army had ever forced her through. She used the moment of his commitment to the thrust as her window. Her right hand moved. Her body rotated. She grabbed his wrist with the hand that wasn't bleeding, used his own momentum against him like he was a 220-pound sack of wheat and gravity was her ally. The disarm technique wasn't complicated. It was brutal. It was the kind of move you only learned by watching people die, by studying how their killers held weapons, by reverse engineering violence until it became as familiar as breathing. She had him on the floor in 1.8 seconds. The knife clattered across the tile. The man's wrist made a sound like a branch snapping in a winter storm. He was screaming now, a different kind of scream, the sound of someone whose reality had inverted, whose victim had become a weapon, whose certainty had evaporated into the fluorescent-lit confusion of the ICU hallway at 11:16 p.m. on a Thursday that would rewrite the next 7 days of Margaret's life into something she couldn't have predicted and couldn't escape. A hospital security guard stood frozen 12 feet away, his hand hovering near his belt, his eyes moving between Margaret and the man on the floor with the shattered wrist. He'd watched the entire sequence without moving. It had taken less than 4 seconds. The guard's face had the particular expression of someone who'd just witnessed a crime scene investigator being revealed inside a timid employee who'd just seen a tactical impossibility executed with the precision of machinery. Margaret stayed on top of the attacker, her breathing level, her voice flat and arctic as the Kandahar night sky. Radio for security backup. Tell them to bring restraints. Tell them to hurry. She said it the way you'd order coffee. She said it like she wasn't bleeding through 2 layers of scrubs, like her right shoulder wasn't screaming a frequency only she could hear, like her left arm wasn't painting the floor red in drips that were already pooling toward the nearest drain. The security guard moved. His radio crackled. Within 90 seconds, 2 more guards arrived with soft restraints and confusion written across their faces in letters 4 feet tall. Margaret released the man to them with the same composure she'd shown during a desert ambush in 2008, and she stood up. Her vision was doing that thing where the edges got interesting, where the overhead lights became stars, where her body was quietly informing her that losing blood came with consequences. A paramedic named Rodriguez arrived pushing a trauma cart. She was young, maybe 26, with hands that moved like she'd done this 1,000 times because she had. She took one look at Margaret's arm and whistled low. 42 stitches minimum on that forearm. That shoulder needs imaging. Rodriguez didn't ask permission. She just started and 4 in Margaret's left elbow, threading the catheter with the kind of ease that only comes from having done it backwards, sideways, in ambulances doing 80 miles per hour on rain-slicked highways. The sutures came next. Rodriguez worked with precise efficiency in the emergency bay, Margaret sitting on a treatment table, her right arm elevated on a pillow, her shoulder throbbing in a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. 42 stitches in the forearm. each one a small thread of dark silk that Rodriguez tied off with surgical knots. The shoulder wound was deeper, messier, the kind of injury that needed someone with more credentials than a paramedic team. But Rodriguez cleaned it anyway, packed it with gauze, and wrapped it with tape that felt like ice against Margaret's burning skin. That's when Dr. Pierce appeared in the doorway. He had 2 hospital trustees with him. Margaret recognized them from board photos, the kind of men whose headshots appeared in the hospital's annual report, the kind who wore watches that cost more than a nursemaid in 6 months. Pierce's face had that particular expression of someone who'd just received a gift wrapped in catastrophe. His eyes moved from Margaret's bandaged arm to her shoulder to the blood on the floor, and something shifted behind his pupils. Not concern. Not anger. Just calculation, cold and efficient as a pharmacy scale measuring poison. "My God," Pierce said, and his voice was honey-smooth, the voice of a man who'd just remembered how to sound human. "What happened to you? Are you all right?" He stepped closer, and one of the trustees followed him like a satellite caught in gravitational orbit. Margaret met his eyes with the steady gaze of someone who'd learned long ago that predators can smell fear and that the best defense against a predator is to show them you're not prey. "I'm fine, Doctor." "You're clearly not fine," Pierce said, and he gestured at the bandages, at the blood, at the crime scene that the ICU hallway had become. "This is a serious incident. A violent attack. Hospital policy mandates that we conduct a full psychological evaluation in cases of trauma-induced incidents. We need to make sure you're fit to continue working." One of the trustees cleared his throat. "Hospital liability is a concern, Margaret. You understand. We're not suggesting anything inappropriate, but violence in the workplace, especially involving a staff member, requires documentation." Margaret didn't respond. She'd learned that silence was a weapon in the right context, that the absence of argument could sometimes be more powerful than any defense. She'd learned it sitting in interrogation rooms across 3 continents. "We'll need to schedule a formal review," Pierce continued, his voice still smooth as surgical lubricant. "Nothing to be alarmed about. Just procedure. Standard protocol when incidents of this nature occur. We'll have an investigator come in tomorrow morning to take your statement." He left then, one of the trustees with him, leaving the other behind like a security deposit against Margaret trying to work her shift. By the time Rodriguez finished bandaging her shoulder and helped her down from the table, Margaret's phone had buzzed with a text from a number she recognized only by context. "Maintain cover. Asset cannot be moved. Handler." The message glowed against her dark phone screen like a warning light in a cockpit. She stood in the emergency bay at 12:34 a.m., bleeding through fresh gauze, her right arm immobilized in a sling, her career evaporating on a timeline she couldn't predict, and understood that everything was about to accelerate. The knife had cut through more than just skin and muscle. It had cut through the careful architecture of a cover that had taken 11 months to construct, and the fissures were already spreading. By morning, an investigator named Collins would arrive with a tablet full of questions that Margaret couldn't answer without destroying the mission. By morning, Pierce would have activated every favor owed to him by every hospital board member who'd ever benefited from his surgical expertise or his willingness to look the other way when certain supply contracts passed through his hands at triple their actual cost. But that wasn't what Margaret was thinking about as she sat alone in the ER at 1:16 a.m., her shoulder screaming, her arm wrapped in 42 sutures, her hands steady as they'd always been because her hands were trained by necessity and muscle memory and the absolute knowledge that breaking down was a luxury reserved for people with better options. She was thinking about what she'd done. She was thinking about how a green beret in room 512 now knew exactly who she was. She was thinking about the fact that she'd made a choice in 1.8 seconds that would cost her everything. She'd made the only choice she could make. The ER treatment bay smelled like antiseptic and copper. Margaret sat on the examination table while a second-year resident with trembling hands worked on her left forearm, threading a surgical needle through torn skin with 42 sutures in neat, methodical rows. The needle went in. Pulled through. The resident's concentration was absolute, his jaw clenched like he was defusing a bomb instead of closing a wound. 43. 44. Margaret watched the thread disappear and reappear, a rhythm as mechanical as a ventilator. The pain was information. Each stitch was data telling her the blade had gone deep, had severed something that would take weeks to rehabilitate. She didn't move. Didn't wince. Just watched the resident work while nurses bustled past, their eyes sliding away from her like she was already a ghost. Her right shoulder was different. That wound required deeper repair, the kind that brought in the attending surgeon, the kind that meant ligament damage and months of physical therapy Margaret wouldn't have time for. The surgeon, a woman named Dr. Reeves with grey streaking her dark hair, worked in silence, her movements precise as a concert pianist. She had the kind of calm that came from having already survived the worst. Margaret recognized it. Respected it. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Dr. Reeves understood that some nurses weren't just nurses, and she made the repairs with the efficiency of someone who'd learned long ago not to ask questions that would require lying to answer. The sutures pulled tight. Drainage tube inserted. Pressure bandage wrapped with enough tension to stabilize the joint but not enough to restrict circulation. Margaret clocked the technique, military issue, the kind you learned in field medicine courses, the kind that belonged in forward surgical teams, not civilian trauma bays. By the time the resident finished the forearm, bandaging it with the precision of someone terrified of being sued, the clock read 10:53 p.m. Margaret's phone buzzed twice. She ignored it. The third buzz came from a secure line, her handler, almost certainly. But the ER had eyes, had witnesses, had the kind of institutional attention that notices when a nurse suddenly has secure communications. She'd deal with it at home. If she still had a home after this. The resident offered her a sling. She took it, slipping her arm through the support with her left hand, her right shoulder already singing with pain despite the local block. The bandage around her arm was pristine white, stark against her scrub top. Blood under her fingernails. She'd have to scrub that away before anyone noticed. Before anyone started asking what kind of nurse had fingernails stained with someone else's blood and muscle memory in her disarm technique. Dr. Reeves walked her to the door. 23 stitches in the shoulder. 44 in the arm. You're cleared for discharge if someone stays with you. She paused, then added quietly, that was a military disarm. I've only seen that technique once before. Fort Sam Houston, 1998. Margaret met her eyes. Held the contact. Reeves nodded once, then turned and walked back into the treatment bay. No questions asked. No answers required. By 11:15 p.m., Margaret sat in the Cedar Creek administrative office, waiting for the discharge paperwork. The fluorescent lights hummed their electric prayer. Her shoulder screamed through the painkillers. She was on ibuprofen and acetaminophen only, nothing stronger, nothing that would impair her reflexes or cloud her thinking. The hospital pharmacy had already flagged her file as a safety concern. She could see it in their eyes, the subtle shift from colleague to liability. At 11:44 p.m., her phone buzzed again. Then again. 3 messages from an unknown number, *call now. Secure line ***urgent ***now ***. She didn't get the chance. At 11:52 p.m., while she was still signing discharge papers with her left hand, her right shoulder immobilized, Dr. Pierce entered the office with a hospital security guard and 3 people Margaret recognized from board meetings, trustees named Westbrook, Halverson, and Chen. Their faces carried the grim determination of men and women about to execute a decision they'd already made. Pierce's voice was steady, almost conversational, as he placed a folder on the desk. We're initiating a formal credentialing review. Independent investigator arriving at 8 a.m. Your access badge is suspended effective immediately. Margaret looked at the folder. Didn't open it. Knew exactly what it contained, her nursing license, her references, her background check. All of it carefully constructed, all of it sufficient to pass casual scrutiny, all of it designed to collapse the moment someone with real authority began pulling threads. The trustees stared at her, waiting for a reaction. Anger. Defense. Fear. Something. She gave them none of those things. just a slight nod and the question, "Will that be all?" Pierce's jaw tightened. He hadn't expected composure. He'd expected a scared nurse scrambling to explain employment gaps and mysterious references. Instead, he got a woman who looked at 3 hospital trustees like they were orderlies who'd wandered into the wrong wing. "Your career at Cedar Creek is finished, Captain," he said, then stopped. His eyes narrowed. He'd said it without thinking, testing, and Margaret's body language didn't change because she'd spent 23 years learning not to react to words spoken by men who thought they held power. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Trustee Westbrook shifted his weight and asked, "Did he just call you?" "Discharge against medical advice," Margaret said quietly. "My choice. I'm leaving now." She stood, her arm in the sling, her shoulder a white star of pain, and walked out of the office while Pierce stared after her with confusion beginning to crack his certainty. The security guard didn't move to stop her. He'd seen what she'd done to the knife attacker. He wasn't getting paid enough to find out if she could move just as efficiently with one arm. At 3:14 a.m., Margaret sat in a Waffle House booth 3 blocks from Cedar Creek Medical, the kind of diner that existed in that strange temporal pocket where nobody asked questions and the coffee never stopped flowing. The red vinyl cracked under her weight. The table was laminated yellow and sticky with spilled syrup from customers who'd given up on life. Outside, the Atlanta night pressed against the windows like a living thing, warm and humid and indifferent to the fact that her career was bleeding out in a hospital somewhere 6 blocks north. Her reflection stared back from the window's black glass, a woman in blood-stained scrubs with an arm in a white sling, the kind of phantom image that belonged in a casualty evacuation tent, not a civilian diner. The coffee in front of her had gone cold 40 minutes ago. She hadn't touched it. Her phone buzzed again. The secure line. She turned it off. Her handler would understand. Or they wouldn't. Either way, the asset was being extracted tonight, according to the last message she'd read in the ER. Operation complete. Mission success despite compromise. Which meant Margaret's value as a deep-cover operative had just expired. She was burned. She was contaminated. She was just a nurse now, except she wasn't, and that was the problem nobody could solve. A waitress with tired eyes refilled Margaret's coffee without asking, and something in that gesture, the casual assumption that Margaret needed care, that she was worth returning to, broke something that had been sealed tight since her first deployment to Ramadi. The tears came silent and immediate, the kind that belong to people who've learned not to make noise when they're breaking. Margaret wiped them away quickly, her left hand shaking despite everything she'd trained herself not to do. But the waitress had already looked away, already turned back to her other tables, already granted Margaret the privacy of grief that you only give to people you recognize as warriors. There's a particular way that certain civilians look at certain nurses, not with pity, but with the understanding that some people carry weight nobody asks them to carry. She pulled the faded unit patch from inside her jacket lining, the 3rd Special Forces Group insignia worn soft from 17 years of handling, and held it in her trembling left hand. The embroidery was barely visible now, the colors bled into each other like old memories. She'd touched this patch before every mission, after every loss, in every moment when staying quiet felt like it would kill her. It had kept her tethered to something larger than herself. It had reminded her why she'd chosen a life where nobody would ever know her name. It had cost her 3 tours, a daughter's wedding, her father's funeral, a promotion ceremony that happened while she was holding a kid's hand as his blood pressure bottomed out in a forward surgical team outside Kandahar. At 3:27 a.m., Margaret still hadn't moved. An ambulance screamed past the diner toward Cedar Creek Medical, its siren cutting through the pre-dawn silence like a surgical blade. She could have gone back. Could have walked into the hospital and picked up the phone and called her handler and screamed about the injustice, about the mission, about the fact that she'd done exactly what she was trained to do and it had cost her everything. Instead, she sat in a broken booth at a dying diner, held a patch that represented the best version of herself, and understood that true sacrifice isn't recognizing what you've given up. It's the moment when you stop expecting anyone to recognize it for you. The waitress brought fresh coffee without being asked, and Margaret nodded, a gesture of gratitude that meant something deeper than coffee refills. The fluorescent lights hummed their electric dirge. Outside, Atlanta slept, unaware that a war had just been fought in its nicest hospital, and the only casualty was a woman nobody would ever be permitted to mourn. 1 week later, Margaret arrived at Cedar Creek Medical at 7 in the morning, her right shoulder taped beneath her scrubs, her left arm still stiff in a compression sleeve. The exit interview. That's what Pierce had called it in the voicemail his secretary left on her phone. Not a conversation. Not a discussion. An exit. She'd known this was coming since the paramedics bandaged her wounds in the parking lot, since the investigator showed up asking questions she couldn't answer without blowing her cover, since the hospital trustees gathered like vultures in Pierce's office with their folders and their whispered certainty that she was a liability. She pushed through the main entrance and stopped. The lobby was silent. Not the normal morning quiet of a hospital, but the kind of silence that arrives when people hold their breath all at once. 75 service members stood in formation across the marble floor, their dress uniforms pressed sharp enough to draw blood, their boots gleaming like black mirrors. Rangers from Fort Benning. Marine dress blues. Navy enlisted in whites. Special forces in their garrison flags. All of them standing at parade rest, absolutely motionless, and every single pair of eyes tracked her the moment she crossed the threshold. Margaret's steps slowed. Her jaw tightened. She kept moving because that's what soldiers do, you keep moving until someone tells you to stop. A Marine gunnery sergeant stepped forward, his uniform a landscape of ribbons, he's bearing the kind you only earned from surviving things that didn't have names. He opened a citation binder with the kind of reverence usually reserved for scripture. Then the doors to the ICU burst open and Callahan came through on his four-pole, and the second Margaret heard his voice, she understood. Phantom, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. That's what we called her. In Ramadi. 2006, she pulled me out of a collapsed building with her bare hands, operated on me in a bombed-out school with nothing but a field kit and a combat knife, and never once asked my name. The gunnery sergeant began to read. Captain Margaret Walsh. Bronze Star with Valor. His voice echoed off the vaulted ceiling, each word heavy as a footfall on concrete. For actions during Operation Iraqi Freedom. For extraordinary heroism in the face of armed combat. For choosing duty over safety, and her comrades over herself. Margaret's expression didn't change. Her hands didn't shake. The mask didn't slip, even as the entire hospital staff materialized from the corridors and stairwells, watching, understanding finally why the quiet older nurse with the graying hair and the soft voice had disarmed a knife-wielding man with the precision of someone who'd done it 1,000 times before. Purple Heart, the gunnery sergeant continued, each word a nail in Pierce's coffin. Meritorious Service Medal. Navy Combat Medical Badge. The last name hung in the air like smoke from an aircraft cannon. Dr. Pierce emerged from his office, his face the color of old chalk. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. This is insane, he said, his voice cracking at the edges like a frozen pond about to break. She's a nurse. I have documentation. I have? The FBI agents walked through the front doors while Pierce was still talking. 2 of them. Man and woman, both moving with the kind of coordinated precision that suggested they'd done this together before. The male agent flashed his credentials so fast it looked like a magic trick. Dr. Richard Pierce. We need you to come with us. Pierce's face went from white to red like someone was turning up a dimmer switch. I'm in the middle of 6 months of medical supply fraud, the female agent said, her voice carrying no inflection whatsoever. Inflated orders. Kickback schemes. Equipment that never arrived. When you attempted to forge Nurse Walsh's personnel records to discredit her testimony, you accessed the National Practitioner Data Bank using credentials you obtained illegally. The agent produced a tablet. Timestamps. Digital signatures. The moment he'd hit submit, 3 federal agencies had triggered automated alerts that hummed and whirred and recorded everything, and now it was all here in miniature on a screen the size of a greeting card. Pierce's expensive shoes scraped against the tile as he backed up. Those were internal hospital records. I was protecting. Callahan's voice cut through the lobby like a scalpel through skin. His forepaw rattled as he took a step forward, his salute arm rock-steady despite the catheter taped to the back of his hand. The unstable employee who took a knife meant for me while you were stealing from patients. That the one you were protecting? The handcuffs clicked onto Pierce's wrists with a sound like a rifle bolt. The FBI agents moved him toward the doors, and his protests echoed off the marble, bouncing back at him like his own voice had turned against him. Wire fraud. Conspiracy. Obstruction of justice. Falsification of federal records. 15 years. The number hung in the air like an accusation. I have lawyers, he sputtered. I have board connections. You can't just. We can, the male agent said flatly. And we are. The doors closed behind him. His shoes, one last scrape of expensive leather against the polished floor, and then he was gone, disappearing into the Atlanta morning where the rest of the city had no idea that one of its surgeons had just been arrested in front of 75 uniformed service members and an entire hospital staff that would gossip about this day for the next 50 years. Margaret later learned through the break room network that he'd taken a plea deal. 5 years probation. Full restitution. And the detail that made everyone go quiet, he was now driving a medical supply van for the very company he'd once extorted, delivering bedpans and gauze to the hospitals that had blacklisted him, his medical license suspended, his reputation a smoking crater. A brigadier general stepped forward then, someone Margaret had served under in Kandahar when she was just phantom and the world was still on fire. He carried Margaret's decorations in a small wooden case lined with velvet, each medal a small weight of recognition for things nobody was supposed to know about. He pinned them onto her blood-stained nurse's scrubs right there in the lobby, and when he finished, he saluted with the kind of precision that suggested respect was something earned in moments like this, in silence and in truth. Callahan maintained his salute with his good arm, his forepaw rattling slightly, his jaw clenched so hard you could see the muscle working beneath his skin. The entire formation came to attention. The hospital staff watched. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Just the fluorescent lights humming their electric dirge and the sound of boots settling into parade rest formation, 75 people who understood that loyalty wasn't a word you said out loud, it was something you showed by standing in formation at dawn in dress uniforms, honoring someone who'd lived so quietly that nobody had known they were standing next to a legend. Margaret returned to her locker to gather the few belongings she'd accumulated in 11 months of being invisible. Her spare scrubs. A coffee mug someone had left behind years ago. A paperback novel with a cracked spine. And on top of her personal items, the faded 3rd Special Forces group patch, the one she'd had sewn into her jacket lining when she first arrived, now cut free and placed with the precision of someone performing a military ritual. Callahan's work. A wordless promise that some people never forget who stood between them and the knife, and some loyalties transcend uniforms and run deeper than orders ever could reach. In the parking lot, the 75 service members formed up one final time, not for cameras or ceremony, but because that's what you do when one of your own has been standing alone in the cold. They formed a corridor from the hospital entrance to her car, their uniforms catching the morning sunlight, their boots moving in synchronized precision, a final salute rendered in formation. Margaret's phone buzzed as she climbed into her car, her shoulder screaming, her arm aching with the kind of pain that reminds you that you're still alive. New orders. A new hospital in a new city. A new cover waiting like a ghost in the mail, and when she opened the secure message, the orders were simple: report to St. Mercy Medical in Chicago. New identity. New mission. New world that had no idea that Phantom was about to walk through their doors wearing scrubs and a faded university ID and the kind of competence that makes people uncomfortable without knowing why. She pulled out of the Cedar Creek parking lot and caught her reflection in the rearview mirror, not the ghost from the Waffle House window at 3 in the morning, but a soldier who understands that true heroism is what you do when the world stops watching, and the few who see it never forget. The FBI's investigation into the supply fraud continued expanding, touching other hospitals, other doctors, other administrators who'd been siphoning money from patients who couldn't fight back. Pierce's cooperation, his desperate plea deal, would become the linchpin that unraveled a network that had operated in the shadows for nearly a decade. But Margaret wouldn't know about that. She'd be somewhere else by then, wearing someone else's name, saving lives under a different cover, standing between the knife and the innocent, because that's what Phantom does and that's what she'll always do, long after the world has forgotten that Cedar Creek Medical ever had a night shift nurse who was something far more dangerous and far more necessary than anyone ever understood. If you're enjoying this, please hit like and subscribe, it really helps the channel. And leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from.